的第二场专题演讲，非常荣幸邀请到爱尔兰媒体委员会 Jeremy Godfrey 主委为我们主讲。Our second keynote speaker today is Mr. Jeffrey Godfrey, Executive Chairperson of Commission Oman.Jeffrey 主委从2023年上任以来，就带领爱尔兰媒体委员会迅速成长，并且推动多项的新兴业务，包含了线上安全、随选影音的监管，还有媒体发展，还有资金支持等重要的领域。他在公司部门有超过30年的丰富经验，横跨了通讯、科技还有数位领域，也曾经在爱尔兰、香港还有英国担任多项重要的职务。Since taking on this role in 2023, Mr. Godfrey has led the organization through a period of rapid growth, expanding its responsibilities in areas such as online safety, video on-demand regulation, and media development and funding.With over 30 years of experience across the public and the private sectors, he has held influential roles in communications, technology, and online industries in Ireland, Hong Kong, and the UK. 那今天呢 ，Jeffrey 主委要跟大家分享的主题是调和数位市场与公共利益，权利、风险与次世代的监管。And today, Mr. Godfrey is going to speak to us about aligning the digital market with the public interest.Rights, risks, and the next generation of regulation. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Mr. Jeffrey Godfrey. 我们掌声欢迎。
各位嘉宾。
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I would like to thank the invitation of the NCC for the opportunity to speak to you. Today, it is my great pleasure to be here. Because I used to stay in Hong Kong for 2 decades. So I'm a good old friend of the Chinese community. But apologies, I'm not that fluent in Mandarin after all, so please allow me to switch to English for the remainder of my talk.
Everybody, distinguished guests, I'd like to, first of all, thank NCC and the other organizers for inviting me to speak. I'm really happy to be here today because I lived in Hong Kong for many years, and I hope you'll consider me to be an old friend. In fact, I think at the start I was reflecting with Edmund Chung that 16 years ago, he and I and some others sat in an airport lounge in Jordan on our way back from the IGF in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. And we all together decided we really needed to have an Asia-Pacific regional IGF. And I remember speaking at the first IGF in Hong Kong in 2010. And I remember speaking also about the importance of taking up IPv6 at that meeting. So it really is a fantastic pleasure to come back today. Just a very brief introduction of Commission Oman, the Irish media regulator. We are a content regulator. We also regulate the content platforms and the way in which they handle. We don't regulate individual content. We're not a censor. We're not a content moderator, but we regulate the way in which the platforms deal with content. And our remit in Europe is to regulate the platforms that have their European headquarters in Ireland. Now, Ireland has been really successful in attracting inward investments, so that means we regulate people like X, TikTok, Meta, and so forth. Also, companies like Shein and Temu also fall within our remit, which is to some extent jointly with the European Commission, depending on the particular obligations involved. So just to give an outline of what I'd like to cover in today's keynote is, like many of the other speakers, I think our vision is for a thriving, safe, trusted online environment where people's fundamental rights are upheld. I don't think that's a particularly controversial thing to want, but I do think also most of us would recognize that we are quite a long way from achieving that. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about, first of all, the benefits. The word thriving is very important in that. This isn't just about, we need to keep people safe, we need to have a trusted environment, but we need to make sure that people get the benefits. And we've talked, again, some of the other speakers talked about innovation. Very important that we have room for innovation, but that the innovation works for people. So we need to understand the benefits, we need to understand the harms. And we don't want to have to choose one over the other. We want to make sure we have a way of achieving both. And in order to do that, we need to understand what are the market failures that lead to the harms. Then we can put in place measures that maximize the opportunities and mitigate the harms. So briefly to talk about the benefits. The online world, and I think it's a real pleasure to follow Steve Crocker, because I think I think someone said we all stand on the shoulders of giants to look further, and it's a real pleasure to be imagining ARPA in the 1960s and see how the enormous benefits society globally has achieved as a result of the pioneering innovation. So we've seen economic growth, we've seen people connected across the world, people from minorities finding their own tribe. We've seen enhancements to people's learning. We've seen improved ways of relaxing. It was great on the airplane on the way over to see lots of people discussing whether or not a goal should have been disallowed in a key English Premier League game, which was helped me pass the time a lot. And we also see immense increases in civil society and civic participation. And I think we're seeing similar benefits from AI. We've seen fantastic things in, say, the protein folding, in enhanced productivity in coding, in medical diagnostics, in translation, and so forth. But all these benefits have come with some harms. We've seen algorithmic amplification of toxic content. So people from minority groups suffer from hatred, from incitement to violence. We've seen addictive design features which have led children to spend far too much time looking at screens, not enough time developing in other ways. We've seen worse things for children around child sex abuse and exploitation material, grooming. We've seen threats to civic participation through misinformation and disinformation, and even just the polarization of political debate. We've seen recently a proliferation of AI-generated abuse imagery. We've seen threats to people's mental health. So on the one hand, immense benefits, on the other hand, real harms that are very damaging to society. So how has this come about? Why do we see the harms? Well, it's kind of common to see market failures. And that markets don't always deliver societally optimum outcomes. So if you look at other sectors, we see, say in the environmental field, we have environmental regulation that deals with those negative externalities. And we've dealt with that essentially by asking polluters to pay, so that we don't allow polluters to impose the costs on society. Generally, we make them internalize the costs. That then has led to development of cleaner technologies and so forth. In labour markets, we've seen there's an inequality of bargaining power between employers and employees. So we see regulations on things like minimum wages, health and safety at work, and so forth. And then very relevantly, we see in the consumer protection field and product safety field, where there's real information asymmetry. Consumers can't tell just by looking at a product whether it's safe, so we have safety standards that get applied. And then lastly, we have addictive products, gambling, tobacco, and so forth, where we've used techniques like age restrictions on use, we've used taxation to influence the market, we have restrictions on advertising, restrictions on where things can be used. But digital markets have some unique characteristics too, which I think have led to some of the harms arising. One is that they've evolved to be two-sided markets. So you have the users who are typically given free services, and you have advertisers who generate the revenues. That's led to services being optimized for the interests of advertisers rather than optimized for the interests of users. And particularly in these two-sided markets with network effects, we often don't have very much competition. You have people with a lot of market power. So it's quite possible to innovate in a way that actually harms the interests of users and it enables them to be exploited more, their data to be exploited more, so as to increase their value. And that monetizing of attention and data leads people to aim for more engagement, make their services addictive, collect data which can harm people's privacy, autonomy, and equality. And it has a particular impact on children and on other vulnerable users. So the pressure in those companies is to spend vast amounts of money on time to market, on optimizing the commercial impact of their services, but not to spend the same money on safety by design and on achieving responsibility. And the other thing that I think is different about digital markets is that actually we have fundamental rights are at stake. So it's not just economic rights, not even safety. We have issues like freedom of expression, we have human dignity, the right to participate in free and fair elections. All these rights are actually, they conflict a little bit with one another. A balance needs to be struck between rights. Different jurisdictions will strike that balance in different ways. But it really is not a great idea to leave that balance to be struck by commercial entities who are going to strike that balance in a way that favors their bottom line. So you think about what do we do about this? Well, we can see many examples of rules being set across the world. So in Europe, we have the Digital Services Act, which looks at the systemic risks posed by the largest platforms. It has rules about transparency. It has rules about notice and action for illegal content. It has rules about child protection. In Ireland, we have a supplementary online safety code that deals with video sharing platforms. That's for all the video sharing platforms headquartered in Ireland, so that includes YouTube and TikTok. And in that code, we have some more specific prescriptive measures. So, for example, they are required to have effective forms of age assurance so that if a platform that permits pornography or other adult-only content like gross or gratuitous violence is not, must use age assurance so that children can't normally see it. We've also got rules that say that there are certain types of content, such as promotion of suicide and self-harm, that can't be on those the platforms need to have in their terms and conditions that is banned. The UK has an Online Safety Act, which calls for proactive risk management rather than focusing on takedown. Australia has famously introduced the world's first social media ban for children under the age of 16. Its Online Safety Act also has provisions about moderation, safety by design, and compliance. And there are many others. We see in South Korea, Singapore, Brazil, even the Chinese mainland has a regulation on the protection of children online. So mostly these regimes, they assume a somewhat cooperative, somewhat ethical industry. So I think at the time, for example, the Digital Services Act was going through the legislative process in Europe, it was really all about regulatory dialogue between regulators and platforms on how to make things safe. And this has been backed up by essentially the threat of fines, so comply or we'll fine you. And I think the experience is that these regimes have had an effect and are having an effect, but it's a bit slower, quite a lot slower than people would like. That's in some sense a good thing, because we are talking about policing boundaries on the legitimate exercise of freedom of expression. That's not something that should be done at a whim. It needs to have plenty of checks and balances and legal oversight to make sure. But on the other hand, we see increasing impatience on the part of stakeholders that platforms are not changing their behavior as quickly as possible, particularly in the field of child protection. So there are some improvements you can make to this to the current approach. We found, I think, that more prescriptive rules as opposed to high-level rules and asking platforms to come up with their own ways of complying. Now, after the regulations have been in place a few years, I think the regulators have a much clearer idea about what the harms are and how they might be mitigated. We can increase the resources for regulators, increase the investigative powers to make things a bit quicker. We can also increase individual accountability within the platforms. So I think one thing people often say to me is, well, the trouble with fines is they're just regarded as a cost of doing business. And actually, it's only when the individuals who are making the decisions feel some personal stake in the decisions they're making that you'll get change. And we see that that's happened a bit in the data protection field, where, again, in Europe under the GDPR, every company is obliged to have a data protection officer, which is a statutory role and has some independence of the commercial side of the functions of the business. And then we may need to make it easier, or we do have as a real end backup the tool of blocking access to non-compliant services. I was quite struck. I was looking at Polymarket. I won't tell you why I was looking at Polymarket the other day, but there's a market on will X be banned in any European country by the end of 2026. Now, I'm not going to give you any tips on that, but I'm kind of interesting that people are speculating. I must say, I think I'm not I should say that I'm not giving a threat, but I'm saying that is one of the things that people talk about. So but I think rather than that, we need to kind of look at ecosystem design. We need to think about ethical duties as well as shareholder value for companies. So maybe incorporating things like the UN Guiding Principles on Human Rights into company law might be a tool we can use. We should also accept that the business model of monetizing users is not inevitable. It's what has emerged in the unregulated space, but other models are available, such as freemium, subscription models, and so forth. And it's quite possible that as we put in place more restrictions on how users are monetized, that will create space for other business models to emerge. Also, I would say we have I haven't talked about, there are pro-competition models. So as well as the safety side, there is the competition side. So in Europe, we have the Digital Markets Act. If we can make markets more competitive, then again, some of the incentives to make services unsafe will drop away. And we can also consider maybe thinking outside the normal box of things like taxation, and I think very importantly is empowering, educating users so that they can take some steps themselves to ensure their own safety. So if we think about the future, just to summarize, trust, safety, rights protection, economic value, they're not trade-offs, but they are, we need to think of them as mutually reinforcing drivers of a healthy digital environment. We might want to think about how do we change the basis of competition so that safety, transparency, and ethical innovation become important dimensions of competition rather than just effective exploitation of engagement. How do we get a governance and regulatory model that treats fundamental rights and economic growth as aligned objectives rather than as opposing forces? And recognizing that there are differences in values between different countries, and I think a few speakers earlier on talked about the need for international cooperation. How can we coordinate governance internationally, particularly on areas where there really is a common approach, as I say, like for example, the protection of children online, so that we move beyond harm reduction to a broader concept of digital well-being and sustainability. We think about ecosystem design, not just about reacting to harms, and we think about what are the indicators we might use to tell whether or not we are on the right track for a healthy digital ecosystem. How do we measure trust, safety, media literacy, innovation, and inclusion? So thank you very much. When I went to Ireland, I started to learn Irish. I have to tell you, Irish is a much harder language than Chinese. So I will say, Gramiga Malka, Fei-chan Gan-xie, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Godfrey, for your sharing. Please return to your seats, and thank you for sharing your insights with us. 我们再次感谢 Godfrey 主委非常精彩的专题演讲，再次感谢。